Today we are continuing with our series called A Season of Thanks. And last week we looked at how we can find gratitude through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. And we looked at 2 Corinthians 5. And we talked about how we should or why we should be thankful for the sacrifice of Christ. That our gratitude for Christ should change our perspective or should shift our perspective and change how we look at not only ourselves, but how we look at those around us, how we view the world, and how we should no longer see people from a worldly point of view, but we should see them through the eyes of Christ. Just as Christ looks at you and I, we should view other people. And that we should live our lives for Christ and for His mission. Not for our own independent missions, but for the reason that Jesus Christ has us here in this world where He has us. Whether it is our homes, our places of business, wherever we may be. And today we're going to look at the Lord's timing. We're going to talk a little bit about how prayer and the Lord's timing intermingle and how we are to be patient in the Lord's timing. And there was a quote that I found this week that I thought was incredibly fascinating. It says this. It says, "Some people think the prayer of faith is crawling out on a limb and then begging God to keep somebody from sawing it off. But that is not real prayer, that is presumption. If God makes it clear that He wants you out on a limb, fine. You will be perfectly safe there. If not, it is presumptuous to crawl out on that limb expecting God to keep you there." And so as we look at the story of Hannah and the birth of Samuel, Hannah wasn't just crawling out on a limb in hopes that God would do for her what she desired, but what Hannah did was she placed her entire faith in the Lord and trusted in His timing. And before we get into the story of Hannah today, first we need to understand kind of where we are in the history of both Hannah and Israel to understand where we're at in this story. And so for Israel, we are coming out of the times of the Judges. And so if you were a part of our Judges study, we went through the book of Joshua and then right into the book of Judges. And we know that throughout the book of Joshua and Judges, life in Israel was chaotic. God brought the Israelites out of Egypt and into the wilderness. And then finally, He brought Joshua and Israel into the promised land. And then they had to fight for what was theirs. After not respecting the Lord and trusting in the process, they wandered for 40 years, and then finally God brought Joshua into the promised land. And then once established in the promised land, God then brought judges to judge the nation of Israel. However, what we see with those judges is that they did not always do according to what the Lord, or that Israel did not always do according to what the Lord had put in front of them. And so the judges then had to correct Israel. And so in this time, we see that Israel was in a time of unrest. It was chaotic. There was tension. And so the nation as a whole, they were over this period of judges. They no longer wanted judges correcting them. They wanted a king. They were tired of other nations having a king and Israel not having a king. So the entire nation as a whole is tired, they're frustrated, they're looking for more than what the Lord had to offer. And they were at the end of their trust in the Lord. And so all of this chaos going around at this time, and then here we have Hannah. And in the story of Hannah, we don't really know much about her before 1 Samuel chapter 1, but what we find out very quickly is that Hannah is barren. And in her culture, being barren, being unable to have children was a source of deep shame. It could be seen as a form of punishment for sin that somebody carried in their lives. They would see her as somebody that had something that she was hiding from everyone else. She must have done something that really upset God for God not to give her children. We also know that her family life was chaotic. She was one of two wives of Elkanah. And while he loved her as his wife, and he also loved his other wife, Peninnah, she had many children and would often taunt Hannah, causing her great distress. And so her emotional state at this moment was not the best. She was constantly mocked and had lack of children, and it left her in deep sorrow. She would weep and could not eat during the day, and their yearly trips to Sheol would bring her more despair every time they would travel. But this did not affect her devotion to the God of the universe. Despite her despair, Hannah was devoted to the Lord. She would still make her yearly pilgrimage to the tabernacle to worship and pray constantly. And so in 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 1 tells us this. It says, there was a certain man in Ramoth Zepham, in the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, the son of Jeroham, the son of Eliahum, the son of Toham, the son of Zephah, an Ephraimite. And he had two wives. The name of one was Hannah, and the other was Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. And so at this strategic time, in this very strategic place, God began his plan, as he almost always does, with the person that he has chosen to use within this story. Because we know that God can work on his own, that he can do things himself or by his angels or by a number of other means, but his normal method is to find a certain man or a certain woman to do his work through. And so we're introduced to Elkanah, the husband. And he was a descendant, and he was a part of the lineage of the Levites. And the Levites were the priesthood within the nation of Israel. And so he was called an Ephraimite because he lived within this Levitical city, but it was not because he was a tribe of Ephraim. It was because he was a Levite that was placed within this area. And it also tells us that this Levite was a man of two wives. Polygamy was a fact of life in the ancient world. However, Scripture never puts polygamy in a favorable light. This was never something that was blessed by God. And we even see back in the Deuteronomical law where God gives them laws about multiple wives. He says, you should not do this, but if you are going to do this, you should not favor one wife, nor should you favor the children of one wife. And there was an intense competitive relationship between these two women. And we can see why, we can understand why. One had multiple children and one was barren. And so the fact that there was this rivalry going on indicates that there was probably some sort of struggle happening. Trapp goes on to tell us that polygamy was always a sin, though in patriarchs and ancient saints, a sin of ignorance. And so these wives coming together and being with their husband, one having children and one not, there was this rivalry going on. And we see that greatly affect Hannah as she continues on in her life. We continue on into verse 3. It says, now this man used to go up year by year from the city to worship and sacrifice to the Lord of hosts at Shiloh, where the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were priests of the Lord. And one day when Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions to Peninnah, his wife, and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion, because he loved her, though the Lord had closed her womb. And her rival used to provoke her grievously to irritate her, because the Lord had closed her womb. So it went on year by year. As often as she went to the house of the Lord, she used to provoke her. Therefore Hannah wept and would not eat. According to the law of Moses, Israelites could not worship God through sacrifice at any time and in any way they pleased. They were to bring sacrifices to the tabernacle and to the priests, which were at the time in Shiloh. And it tells us exactly how this scene was set up. We have these priests that were mentioned by name because they were known notoriously as wicked priests. And their mention here shows how godly Elkanah was. Even though the priests were wicked, he still offered sacrifices to the Lord, knowing that the wickedness of the priest did not make his own service to the Lord invalid. But it shows us here that he still was showing favoritism, that even though his heart was right for the Lord, he was not following the law as was intended. That he would bring his family each year to the tabernacle for sacrifice. He would eat the ceremonial meals at the tabernacle with his family, giving portions to his wife and their children. But he showed favor and love to Hannah by giving her double portions. But in this moment, Hannah's reaction was to not eat. Because the conflict between her and the other wife, Hannah could not enjoy this display of love and favor of her husband. It's possible for problems at home to make your time at the house of the Lord miserable. David Guzik says that Hannah is at the house of the Lord with a blessed double portion in front of her, and she cannot enjoy it. Oftentimes you'll hear me pray as we get ready for worship. My prayer is that we can leave everything that is going on outside of these walls. Because many of us bring in baggage with us every Sunday. Many of us come in here every Sunday with something heavy on our hearts. And my prayer is that when we step into our time of worship together, that we can leave those things outside of these walls. Because in this moment that we have together on Sunday mornings, we are here to worship the God of the universe. And there is nothing that the enemy enjoys more than distracted worship. There is nothing the enemy loves more than us being distracted from a moment that the Lord is trying to have with you and I. And that is what is happening here for Hannah, year after year after year. And it tells us exactly why it's happening, because the Lord had closed her womb. Beyond Hannah's powerful trial, there was purpose. God used the trial of her closed womb to accomplish something great in her life, to further the whole plan of salvation. Even though things were hard, God was still in charge. It seems strange that Peninnah, who seemed of bad character, was blessed with children, and Hannah, who was of good character, was cursed with barrenness. Often we don't understand God's ways until He completes His plan. We continue on into verse 8. And Elkanah, her husband, said to her, Hannah, why do you weep? And why do you not eat? Why is your heart sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons? After they had eaten and drunk in Shiloh, Hannah rose. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat beside the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. She was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. She vowed a vow and said, Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant and remember me and not forget your servant, but will give me, your servant, a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall touch his head. Ladies, y'all take a break for a second. Gentlemen, this is not how you respond as a husband. This is not how you respond as a husband when you see your wife crying, especially in times of barrenness. I've walked through several couples. I've had many friends that have gone through times of not being able to conceive a child. And fortunately enough, I've never had a friend dumb enough to say, am I not enough for you? Because that's really dumb. There's your husbandly advice for the day. But his response to Hannah's sorrow, we really see that he did love her. It's true that he loved her. Not just because he provided more for her, but he truly did love her. Yet, like many men, he was insensitive to what she was going through. He didn't recognize that she had needs he could not fulfill, such as the desire to be a mother. Not only did she want to be a mother, but culture told her that she had to be a mother to truly be an effective woman within this culture. And so Hannah did exactly what Hannah should have done. Hannah didn't go to her husband and say, why don't you do more to make sure that I can have children? She turned to the Lord. Hannah was in bitterness of her soul and great anguish, yet she did the right thing. She took those bitter and anguished feelings to God honestly in prayer. How often are you and I in times of trial and of heartache truly going to the Lord? And going to the Lord in honesty. Because oftentimes, again, I'll be sitting with somebody that's saying, Pastor, I'm struggling, I'm going through heartache, I am in so much distress. And then I'm like, well, let's pray together. And then we pray and they're like, Lord God, I love you so much. Thank you for all that you've done. Let's be honest with God. God, I'm hurting. God, I am struggling. God, I am in pain and I need you so much. Because here's a little secret that you might not know. Even if you don't tell the Lord what you're going through, He knows what you're going through. Even if you don't say the words, God, I am hurting, the Lord knows that you are hurting. So why are we lying to Him in prayer? Why are we not honest with Him in prayer? I loved those conversations with teenagers when I was doing youth ministry where we would talk about honest prayer. Well, how honest can I be with God? Well, as honest as you would be with yourself, because He knows your most inner thoughts. Why would you not be honest with Him in prayer? Because if you thought it, if you felt it, He knows it. So why would you not be honest in prayer? And so Hannah begins her prayer by calling out to the Lord. By using a phrase that is used 260 times throughout the Old Testament, Lord of hosts. Hannah felt so attacked by her rival, so she called the Lord of mighty armies to be her protector. If you think that you're walking alone through heartaches and trials, you are not walking alone. Because you have the God of the universe that has fought every battle and has won on your side. But not only does she go to the Lord, but she vows and makes a promise. She promised her son to the work of the Lord, vowing that he would be a Nazirite from birth, saying that I will not let a razor touch his head. This was a vow of the Nazirites. According to number 6, the vows of the Nazirites included abstinence from any product of the grapevine, taking no part in mourning for the death, nor come near a dead body, because the dead show the corruption and the fruit of sin. Another vow was never cutting the hair, because it was public, visible sign of others of the vow that they have taken. And typically, the vow of a Nazirite was taken for a set, or rather a short period of time. But as we see in the life of Samuel and Samson, they were both unique because they were Nazirites from birth. Hannah was telling the Lord, I will literally give you this baby from the first breath that he breathes. If you will just give me a son, I will give him back to you immediately. I will give him to you all the days of his life. The child was already dedicated as a Levite because God regarded the tribe of Levi as his own special possession. But the time of the Levite special dedication to the Lord only lasted from about the age of 30 to 50. So Hannah took something that already belonged to the Lord and gave it again to him in a greater way for his entire life. And in this dedication of a Nazirite, which was a great consecration than any other Levite before. We continue on into verse 12. And as she continued praying before the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was speaking in her heart, only her lips moved and her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli took her to be a drunken woman. And Eli said to her, how long will you go on being drunk? Put your wine away from you. Again, we run into another very unhelpful man. But it tells us she was praying continuously. This means she was multiplying in her prayer. And we only have a recorded bare summary of Hannah's prayer, but that means that she just kept saying this over and over and over again. Lord, this is my desire. If you give me a child, I will give him back to you. And my belief is that she just kept saying this time and time again. But we see that her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. And it's often good to pray aloud because it can help us better focus on our thoughts. Yet this passage shows us that prevailing prayer doesn't need to be vocal. Effective prayer can be silent and in the heart. When we talk about praying continuously, it's not realistic for us to be praying all day, every day, out loud and in person. People might think you're crazy. If you're sitting at your desk at work and you're praying out loud, people might start thinking something about you. But that doesn't mean that we can't be sitting there focusing on the Lord as we are doing our work. And Hannah represents exactly what that looks like. Praying and spending intimate moments with the Lord without words ever coming out of her mouth. But we see Eli completely misunderstand what's happening here. He misunderstood Hannah, but the fact that he suspected that she was drunk shows that it may not have been unusual for people to become drunk at the fellowship meals with the Lord at the tabernacle. The fact that Eli suspected Hannah of drunkenness didn't speak well from what was going on at the tabernacle at the time. Because at the time, the priesthood of the Levites had become corrupt. It had become something that it was not supposed to be. That these two sons of Eli had become some of the most wicked priests within the priesthood. And so the fact that people were showing up to fellowship within the house of the Lord and getting drunk was something that was culturally okay, but not spiritually what was supposed to be happening. Adam Clark says the fact that Eli supposed her to be drunk and the other of the conduct of Eli's sons already mentioned proved that the religion was at the time a very low ebb in Shiloh. For it seems that drunken women did come to the place, and lewd women were often found there. This was a place of corruption. And so for Eli to speak out against what was happening shows that he wasn't looking at the heart of Hannah, he was looking at the actions. But her heart showed exactly what was happening. Verse 15. But Hannah answered, "No, my Lord, I am a woman troubled in spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord. Do not regard your servant as a worthless woman, for all along I have been speaking out my great anxiety and vexation." Then Eli answered, "Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition that you have made to him." And then she said, "Let your servant find favor in your eyes." Then the woman went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. Hannah did not accept Eli's accusations. He was not going to let her downplay the moment that she was having with the Lord. She was there in true worship and in true honesty in this moment, telling the Lord exactly what she was going through. However, we see that she did not respond in arrogance or in some sort of hateful tone. She would explain herself, but she did it remembering that he was still her high priest. Telling him, "I have poured out my soul to the Lord. I am struggling. I am hurting. I am giving my heart over to him." And that's exactly what Hannah needed to do in this moment. Instead of keeping the bitterness of her soul and the anguish of her heart, she poured it out before the Lord. And finally, somebody hears her. Finally, Eli speaks because somebody finally acknowledges what she's going through. He says, "May the God of Israel grant your petition." And we don't know Eli's heart. Eli may have spoken this only as kind of a wish, but it was in fact a word directly from the Lord. And this completely changed the way that Hannah was acting. It says that her face was no longer sad, that you could see it on her face, that she truly believed in this moment that God was going to move in her life. This change in Hannah's countenance shows that she received the promise with faith, something necessary if we will inherit the promises of the Lord. Hannah shows how we can regain the joy of fellowship in the house of the Lord again by pouring out our hearts before the Lord and receiving His word with faith. Because He could have said, the Lord will grant you exactly what you have asked for. And she could have said, great. Sounds good, Eli, thanks. But the fact that she truly believed in this moment. Verse 19. It says, they rose early in the morning and worshiped before the Lord. Then they went back to their house at Ramah, and Elkanah knew Hannah, his wife, and the Lord remembered her. And in due time conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Samuel. And she said, I have asked for him from the Lord. Hannah could genuinely worship the Lord in faith while the promise was yet not fulfilled. This glorious pattern of faith is represented in the life of Hannah. Hannah did not know that she would become pregnant yet. All she had was the promise of Eli and the faith in the Lord. But it tells us the Lord remembered her. To use the term remembered is a way of explaining God's actions in humans' terms that we can understand. Even if it doesn't perfectly describe God's actions, even if it isn't as if God ever forgot Hannah, but it is proper to say He remembered her. And it didn't happen right away. It tells us that some time passed. In due time, verse 20 tells us. Hannah had enough reason to be discouraged, but when the promise of the Lord was spoken, she did not lose her faith in the promise, even after it took some time. She is a great example of those who through faith and patience inherit the promise of the Lord our God. Hannah deeply desired a child but could not have one. But even still in her pain, she prays honestly to the Lord and promises that if He gives her a son, she will dedicate him to His service. God hears her prayer, and in His timing, Hannah gives birth to Samuel, who then goes on to become one of Israel's greatest prophets. What this story shows us today is that God hears our prayers even when the answers seem delayed. Even when the answers aren't immediately there and it's not right in front of our faces, that God still hears our prayers. Not only that, but His timing is not our timing, but it's always the right timing. Because we're impatient. Maybe it's just me, but I'm very, very impatient. But when we wait faithfully, God's answers often bring great blessing, greater blessings than we ever could imagine. And what's so beautiful is that what we see happen is that she does exactly what she said she was going to do. The rest of chapter 1, it tells us that she then has conversations with her husband about what's going to happen next. How is she going to then give Samuel back to the Lord? They argue, they conversate about it, what's going to happen, and so they come up with a plan that she's going to nurse him until he's done nursing, and then she's going to turn him back over to the Lord. But most importantly, what I find so fascinating is her prayer in chapter 2. And we're going to take a look at a couple of these points, but in verses 1 and 2 it says this. 1 Samuel chapter 2, she says, "My heart exalts in the Lord. My horn is exalted in the Lord. My mouth derides my enemies because I rejoice in your salvation. There is none holy like the Lord, for there is none besides you. There is no rock like our God." as 1 Samuel chapter 1 ends and she turns Samuel back over to the Lord and gives him over to the priesthood, she continues worshiping the Lord. Because God fulfilled his promise, so she worships. This song here, this prayer here, records the worship Hannah offered the very day she left her little boy behind. Her only child, the child she prayed for years and years and years, she now turns back over to the Lord and she celebrates. Because God kept his promise, so Hannah kept hers. Hannah showed a depth of commitment and love for the Lord that may humble us. It should humble us. Because on the day she made the biggest sacrifice of her life, she still rejoices in the Lord. Notice, though, that she rejoices in the Lord. She could not rejoice in leaving her son, but she could rejoice in the Lord. In the most desperate situations, when we have nothing else to rejoice in, we can rejoice in the Lord. We might still face trials, we might still struggle, we might still have pain, but we still have the Lord. Not only that, but Hannah touches on a few things that have happened in her life, like her enemies. Thinking back to her husband's other wife, Peninnah. She cruelly brought Hannah to her low, but now Hannah rejoiced because the Lord lifted her up. The Lord brought her out of that shame. And in her words, she still celebrated that there is none as holy as the Lord. For her to say that there is none as holy as the Lord is to completely set him apart. That he is unique, not like any other. And when she continued in the same verse and said, "For there is none beside you," she is saying the same thing as there is none holy like the Lord. She says it again in a different way. Nor is there any rock like our God. Hannah truly believed what she was saying in this moment. She celebrated and worshiped the Lord because he brought her out of humiliation. He brought her out of life of barrenness and brought her into glory after years and years and years of struggle. And out of all of this, what we see happen is the life of Samuel would be a life that would completely change the world around us. Samuel would go on to do some really amazing things. Samuel would receive favor from God and from man in 1 Samuel chapter 2. In chapter 3, God anoints Samuel to the position of prophet and judge, and then later on, he would become a famous prophet throughout all of Israel. In chapter 7, Samuel would lead forces of Israel against the Philistines at Mizpah. And then Samuel in that same chapter would now be promoted to the judge over all of Israel. In chapter 8, the people would reject Samuel's sons as the next judge and demand a king. So in chapter 9, God anoints Saul as the king and tells Samuel about his decision. In chapter 15, God tells Samuel to reject Saul as king. In chapter 16, Samuel would then anoint David as king. And then in chapter 28, Samuel would die at Ramah. And all of Israel would mourn his death. But all of this would come because of Hannah's faithfulness to serving the Lord. This passage of text shows us that we need to be thankful of the Lord's timing. It shows us how to be thankful of the Lord's timing. It shows us that God is working even when we can't see it. And that his delays are not denial of what we are requesting. They are opportunities for us to trust him more deeply. And when his answers come, it often leads us to deeper worship and gratitude, just like Hannah's song of praise. So today there's a few things that I want us to pull out of this text. The first one being this: patience is a fruit of the Spirit. If we are going to live and carry the fruits of the Spirit with us, as Christ tells us to, we begin to see waiting not as a punishment, but as a part of God's plan. To have patience means that we are producing the fruits of the Spirit as Jesus describes them. We remind ourselves that God's wisdom is greater than ours. That we do not carry the same wisdom as the God of the universe. That what might mean wait right now is to wait for a very good and specific reason. That we don't have to rush things in life because God has a plan for us. That we learn to think with faith and not frustration, trusting His timing over our own. Guys, this is such a hard concept for us to grasp because we want things now. Immediacy is such a big part of our culture. I know I'm not the only one that's gotten really frustrated about Amazon not delivering in 2 days anymore. Yeah? Immediacy is a big part of our culture. But what the Lord is showing us is that patience is a necessity for our lives. Because His timing is better than ours. The next thing that I want us to pull out of this text is that waiting does not mean the Lord has abandoned us. Just because the Lord is telling us to pause for a minute does not mean that He has abandoned us. Instead of despair or bitterness in waiting, we should feel peace and hope knowing that the Lord hears us. The Lord heard Hannah in her moments of anguish, and she still had to wait. But the Lord was glorified in her waiting. Instead of having impatience, gratitude should replace that impatience. We should thank God even before the answer comes. Lord, this is what I need you to do. This is what I want you to do. But even if you don't, I know that you are in control. My prayer for us is that we experience joy when we see His faithfulness unfold, just like Hannah did. Hannah watched His faithfulness unfold over years and years and years. And even when she still had to turn that baby over back to the Lord, she glorified the Lord. Finally, we should be active in the moments of wait. Because there are going to be moments of wait. We should pray persistently like Hannah did. Pouring out our hearts to God honestly. Because He already knows your heart. Why not be honest with Him? He already knows what you're going through. Why keep secrets from Him? Just because He is telling you to wait does not mean that we are to sit idly and wait for something to happen. We should be praying honestly and persistently. We should worship and give back to God when He blesses us, recognizing that everything that we have comes from Him. And we should live our lives with patience and humility, trusting in His timing in every area of our lives. Guys, this is hard. This is a hard concept for us to wrap our heads around. Because in a society where we demand instant gratification, where we demand instant delivery and instant everything, patience is a hard concept. But what you and I should know and should recognize is that God's timing is so much better than ours. And so in this season of thanks, we should look at God's timing with gratitude. Knowing and understanding that the things that we have in our lives don't come because we have rushed them, but they have come because God has guided us to them. So as we wait, and as we work on our patience, do so with gratitude.